On Sunday, August 2nd, 2020, as just about the whole world knows by now, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley successfully splashed down in their Crew Dragon capsule, finally bringing to an end the era of astronauts, American astronauts that is, being taken into space by Russian spacecraft. But as much as we here in the United States would like to look upon this as a big patriotic moment, and certainly I suppose it is, it's much, much larger than that. It's ushering in a new era in manned space transportation, because the Soyuz, after all, was able to carry far less than the Crew Dragon, and also the Soyuz was not a reusable system, whereas at least a good portion of the Crew Dragon setup between the Falcon 9 and the ship itself is. Therefore, this is going to usher in a much easier process of taking humans into space, at least into low Earth orbit. But of course, this is just the first step. One way or another, man needs to go back to the moon. In addition to that, we're looking to go to Mars, and there's some debate as to whether we should go to Mars first or the moon first, how we should accomplish it. The Starship has yet to take its first hop, at least at the time of this recording. And then once all of this is accomplished, what really should we be doing? Should we be looking at colonizing other planets or the moon, or should we instead be looking at colonizing space itself? Because after all, we already have a hell of a lot of experience when it comes to colonizing space between the ISS and various other space stations that the Russians put into place over the decades, and of course Skylab. We've been doing this for a very long time and have gotten pretty good at it, at least on a small scale, and we're planning on putting up commercial space stations soon as well. Why not do it on a vast scale, on a scale to where we could eliminate the problems of microgravity and take Earth's gravity with us? Is this something that we could do? And more importantly, is this something that we should be doing, as opposed to looking to Mars or any other place that we might colonize throughout the solar system? Get ready for an unconventional episode of The Angry Astronaut coming up right now. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, we have a little bit of an addition here. If you didn't have a chance to see the streaming episode, I have a little bit of merch, which is a little difficult to see, but nevertheless, I've got a couple of pictures of this shirt that just arrived. I rather like it, but of course it's my design, so why wouldn't I? But I do like how it turned out, and if you'd like one of these or anything else, there's a lot of links to Teespring on my account. But in any event, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about supporting the channel this time around and get straight to the issue at hand. There is a strong school of thought amongst futurists anyway, and I certainly count myself as a futurist, in terms of whether or not we should be colonizing other planets, or if we should simply be building cities in space. Because after all, if a city is large enough, we can control the gravity. We don't have to worry about 1/3 gravity, 1/4 gravity, 1/8 gravity, that sort of thing, and the unknown impacts that could have on our systems. So why not instead take our gravity with us and build huge, sprawling complexes in low Earth orbit, or more preferably in lunar orbit, where it's easier to get the raw materials up without a whole lot of rockets in order to do the heavy lifting. The largest of these types of space cities, if you'd like to call them that, are ONeill cylinders. And these things are massive works of engineering and would certainly be a huge undertaking for the human species. But in this episode, we're going to do a bit of a comparison. Should we be following Elon Musk's advice and colonizing Mars? Or should we simply be moving out into space and building our colonies for ourselves out there, as a certain person who works for a certain company that I'm not going to mention tends to advocate? And I'm going to try to keep my personal bias against him and his company out of this. So on we go. Space cities versus colonizing planets. Man, does SpaceX move fast. By the time I upload this, SN5 will have either succeeded or failed at its 150-meter hop. We wish them the very best, and as you can see, this footage is provided by Boca Chica Gal, who has generously provided her footage for quite some time on this channel. So instead of trying to cover this, I encourage you to instead go over to her channel and watch this magnificent event take place and subscribe while you're at it. But regardless of what happens, it would have made this guy extremely excited. Gerard ONeill, who was an American physicist who sadly died back in 1992. But in 1976, in his book High Frontier: Human Colonies in Space, he conceptualized the idea of a space city that puts everything else to shame. This king of space cities, now known as an ONeill Cylinder, is actually two rotating cylinders. They actually rotate counter to each other in order to cancel out any of the gyroscopic effects that would prevent the cylinder from maintaining its station, and also to keep it from pointing towards the sun, which would be a rather important thing, and I'll explain that a bit later. But the ONeill Cylinder, at least in its full concept, is absolutely colossal. Each connected cylinder would be approximately 8 kilometers in diameter and 32 kilometers long, and they would rotate so as to provide artificial gravity by their centrifugal force, full gravity just like on Earth. Now, in other episodes, I've talked a bit about what the heavy lift capacity of 1,000 starships might be capable of, but this seems to be a little bit beyond even that, and yet it's been embraced by a pretty prominent guy. That's right, Jeff Bezos has embraced this whole concept as part of his master plan to export heavy intel to return to Earth. Well, there seems to be very strong indications that a return to Earth, barring some sort of leap forward in technology, might be impossible. But nevertheless, in terms of long-term exposure to one-third gravity, we're not entirely certain about that. Now, another advantage that an ONeill cylinder provides is in the field of radiation. You see, even in lunar orbit, the atmosphere of something this huge would be so vast that it would provide its own weather systems and also provide almost complete protection from radiation and cosmic rays. As a matter of fact, the very thin atmosphere of Mars already provides substantial protection. This would be much, much more significant. The notion that a lack of a magnetic field would instantly turn you into ashes within the space of moments is only something that happens in bad science fiction movies. Atmosphere this thick would provide so much protection that your chances of developing cancer, well, they would be moderately increased, but not enough to keep you from living on a cylinder like this. Not even close. And there's another advantage of an ONeill cylinder, and that's the simulation of night and day in space. Remember how I said that it would be important to keep the cylinder oriented towards the sun? Well, that's because you would have these huge windows with hinged mirrors attached. The mirrors would change their location as the cylinder rotated and the sun would appear to track across the artificial sky, creating the illusion of day. And then at nighttime, the mirrors would be completely opened, then giving a complete and unobstructed view to space. making it appear as if it were night. The importance of a night-day cycle on a diurnal species that evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to be in that exact kind of environment, in my opinion, cannot be overstated. And since Mars has a problem with radiation, many of the designs, such as this one, has part-time access to the surface, but the habitation is still subsurface to provide protection from radiation, therefore putting the colonists into an environment of artificial light and artificial darkness that is not nearly as convincing and much more like living in caves. Now, the psychiatric impact of living in caves or mines is well documented, and I have a linked article in the description. However, the notion that Martian colonists would have to live in the darkness at least a great portion of the time is just misguided. This design, called the Martia, which can be 3D printed out of Martian materials, is a double-walled design providing protection against radiation, and through indirect and ingenious methods can provide natural light throughout the entire facility, as you can see here. So Martian colonists certainly have the option of night and day as well. However, perhaps the largest advantage represented by an ONeill cylinder is to protect our environment from our own technology or industrial pollution. Now, this advantage represents the crux of Blue Origin's overall plan, and that is, once again, to export industrial pollution and heavy industry off of Earth, thus eliminating the great amount of the pollution that we put into the atmosphere, which currently amounts to 2.4 million pounds worth of pollutants per second, which, by the way, is leading to an increase of temperature that increases the amount of methane evaporation from the seas and from the soil, increasing the amount of greenhouse gases that are present in the atmosphere as well. Now, if you believe that global warming is a load of dingoes' kidneys, then this is not a serious issue anyway. We can pour as much pollutants as we want to into the atmosphere, and the ONeill cylinders aren't really going to make much of a difference to the climate one way or another. However, if you do believe that this is a serious problem, we hardly have enough time to build something as colossal as ONeill cylinders to deal with this issue before it becomes a problem that gets out of hand. Now, according to the vast majority of climatologists who study this stuff, we have until roughly the middle of the century to take really drastic action about this before it leads to serious consequences to our planet. And if you don't believe in it, as I say, it's not much of an issue. I'm not a climatologist who spent my entire life studying these things, so I'm not going to express an opinion about this particular matter here, only to say that ONeill cylinders are unlikely to do much of anything about it. Now, of course, one thing an ONeill cylinder could do is to provide a certain segment of the human population with a safe haven to retreat to should the Earth's climate go to hell. And this is something that I have talked about Jeff Bezos possibly having as an agenda already. Now, of course, this could be pure paranoia on my part, but I do have a question. Why do all of his conceptual pictures look like the image on the right, or perhaps something like this, instead of those industrial pictures that I showed you in the past? This looks more like a paradisaic utopia than a factory. And this acts as a segue into the perhaps most important aspect, or perhaps drawback, of an ONeill cylinder, and that's the feasibility and the expense of building such a thing. Now, even using the Starship and its amazing lift capacity, something like this would still cost at least $200 billion, if not more, and that's with rough estimates. Now, building a lunar mass driver might simplify matters quite a bit. Now, I've mentioned lunar mass drivers in past episodes, but essentially it uses electromagnetic forces to propel cargo or raw materials away from the moon and out of its gravitational influence, which is fairly easy to do even with today's technology. It would, of course, require that we build a moon base and also the other infrastructure, mining and other things in order to even construct the ONeill Cylinder, but such a thing would make the whole process a lot more doable. Nevertheless, this adds another involved and expensive step to an already very expensive process of building an ONeill cylinder. You have to go to the moon, you have to mine the raw materials, and you have to transport everything out into space. Unlike Mars, which provides a lot of raw materials, water, and other things that you need in order to build a colony that can be self-sustaining, everything, absolutely everything, has to be transported out into space for an ONeill cylinder. From the water to the atmosphere to the agriculture to the plants to everything else, it all has to be transported. Quite an undertaking. And on top of that, there's also the potential problem of scalability. You see, you can start a small colony on Mars with 1 or 2 buildings, like this Martian ice house that uses ice for protection against radiation and also to provide natural light to the inhabitants inside, but you can't do that as easily with a rotating station. Try as you might, it's very difficult to reproduce the effect that gravity has on a natural planet. It's very difficult to do it artificially. The smaller the rotating station, the more artificial it feels. If you turn your head, you can become disoriented. If you drop something, the path deviates. It's just not the same thing. And the smaller the station, the worse the problem becomes, whereas a small station on Mars wouldn't have the same issues. But in my opinion, one of the biggest drawbacks of an ONeill cylinder is its lack of isolation. And while this would seem to be a strike against Mars, it actually isn't. If you want to preserve the longevity of the human species, you want to put as much distance between your colony and Earth as possible. And Mars is 57.6 million kilometers at its closest approach, well outside the range of even some of the most ambitious of nuclear missiles. And even if something were to be launched, you would have plenty of notice, unlike something in lunar orbit that would have little or no notice of an incoming attack. Not a very good way of preserving the human species if it comes to that. But to me, there's a much more important factor to be considered, and I'm not even going to give it its own category. I'm not going to talk about the potential danger of meteoroids to an ONeill cylinder or any of those other issues, the repairs it would need from small pieces of space junk or debris impacting it. Those things are minor. What is the biggest advantage of a Martian colony is experiencing things like this. The Valles Marineris, or volcanoes many times the height of Everest. These sorts of things don't exist on Earth, and they don't exist in space. And when it comes to exploring the solar system, this is what I want to experience. Not taking Earth with me on a massive artificial satellite, but rather experiencing a truly alien world and everything that it has to offer, both its advantages, its disadvantages, its blessings, and its curses. So, I would say when it comes right down to it, being the angry astronaut, there isn't a whole lot about this that really pisses me off, this particular debate, aside from the fact that to put cities in space is going to involve such a massive investment of resources, as I've talked about during the episode, that really doing it is so far in the future and such an undertaking that I don't see us doing it anytime, certainly not within the next century, or maybe by close to the end of this century. We certainly have the ability and the technology to do it, but we're talking a whole lot of engineering and a whole lot of logistics to build something like that versus establishing a slowly growing colony on Mars. That seems a lot more doable to me, and it seems like something that we could get started on immediately. But the most important difference between the two, in my opinion, is unless you build this space city way out in the asteroid belt or around Mars itself, it does not ensure the safety of the human race, as I pointed out during the video. Not at all. It's entirely too vulnerable to nuclear attack. Even if it's in lunar orbit, it's still well within the conceptual range of some kind of missile that we could easily build today. And an ONeill Cylinder would be blasted into ruins by some of our smallest thermonuclear weapons, to say nothing of some of the bigger ones that we could build. And isn't that the main reason, the main logical reason that we're branching out into space, is to ensure the longevity of the species? And we're not going to do that by building these massive utopias in orbit or in lunar orbit. It's simply not going to happen. Going to Mars and going to places even further afield is the only way to ensure the safety of the human species and to ensure that we go on. Not to say that we should never build an ONeill Cylinder, but nevertheless, I think that colonizing other planets should be our first order of priority for a lot of different reasons. You've been seeing some names popping up again, my various supporters. There are many ways to support this channel. As you can see, I've got merch now that I'm getting myself, and there's a wide variety of that. You can support me on Patreon and a variety of other ways, which is in the description. If you want, me to continue making these types of videos, especially in the frequency that I've been making them lately, then please, if you can, feel free to support me. Or if not, subscribing is just as good as far as I'm concerned. But in the meantime, until we decide one way or the other, when it comes down to it, I don't really care. Whether it be space cities or colonizing other planets, we need to get out there. And until we actually do, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.